My name is Lisa Campbell, and I serve as the Dean for Workforce Development here at BC3. And I want to thank you all for coming today, truly. It's a early Monday morning in January, and so we just appreciate you all coming and partaking in the second annual Discover Recovery event hosted by the Geyser Center today. Thank you. I had to make sure I said that right. Okay, I also would like to recognize our elected officials that are with us today. Commissioners Leslie Oshie, Kevin Boozle, I look over here, hello. And also with us is Ryan Martin, representing Representative Marcy Mostella's office today. Thank you all for coming, and we truly appreciate all your support and all that we do in the community. Thank you. So at this time, I would now like to welcome my supervisor, whose leadership and support truly is unwavering, who guides us in our programming and all of our involvement in the community. She serves as BC3's Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Belinda Richardson.
Thank you, Dean Campbell. Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed community members, leaders, we probably have some parents, some staff and friends. Welcome to Discover Recovery, a community dialogue on addiction treatment brought to you by the Ellen O'Brien Geyser Center and Butler County Community College. We gather today to address one of the most pressing issues facing our society. So on behalf of our president, Dr. Nicholas Newpower, our Board of Trustees, and our BC3 family, it is my privilege to welcome you all here today and let you know that your presence underscores the importance of this cause. You see, at BC3, we recognize the vital role that education and collaboration plays in addressing addiction and prevention. We are committed to partnering with community leaders and members to provide resources, support, and education in this critical area. Together, we have the power to make a meaningful impact on the lives of individuals and families affected by addiction. So I extend my deepest gratitude to all of you for joining us in this collective event. And looking over your agenda, wow, I can see that your morning will be filled with a rich exchange of knowledge, wisdom, and insight from clinical and medical experts, beginning with the keynote speaker and moving into, you have some rich stuff here. I have to take off my glasses so I can see, right? Be aware, take action, mind over matter or not. Plan ahead to prevent. It's just a pop can. I'm really interested in that. So this is a really rich agenda, and I'm so excited for each of you today. So thank you to all of the individuals responsible for both the planning and delivery of today's event. And again, thank you for each of you for being here today. Let us move forward with shared determination to create positive change in our community. Thank you.
On behalf of my colleagues, I do just want to say that we are grateful for the support and the collaboration that we have with the Geyser Center. The college has been working with the Geyser Center for many, many years, and we are very proud to continue in our efforts to serve our community for addiction and recovery efforts. We just find that the way we get things done is all working together, and I think all of us in this room truly work together. That's why we're all here, right? So it is my pleasure now to turn the program over to the folks at the Geyser Center and to welcome Joe Mahoney, their Executive Director.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming bright and early on this Monday morning. I know Mondays are always a little shaky, but hopefully you guys find this event worthwhile today. There's some good information, a lot of good information, included in every session. So you really can't go wrong no matter what you pick to attend. I don't want to take a ton of time because I know, we're on a pretty tight schedule today, but I do want to thank a couple very important people today. First of all, obviously Butler Community College. The Geyser Center wouldn't be able to do what we do with these educational events and other outreach efforts without the support of Butler Community College. All the staff there that we work with, but in particular Lisa, who I sort of spitball some crazy ideas to sometimes, and she very calmly looks at me and says, okay, we can make that happen. And we are appreciative of that, and we thank you all for everything that you do for us and to help the community. I also want to thank our board members that are in the room as well. From the Geyser Center, I see a couple familiar faces: Tammy Shuey, Pat Casey, Matt Schnorr, Brandy, and I think that's it. But I want to thank each of you as well for attending this event today, and as always for your support as well. I want to thank our Geyser staff that are in the room, that are either sitting on panels, leading breakouts, helping behind the scenes with logistics and coordination. We couldn't do this without any of you guys. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I also want to thank all the elected officials in the room. That the two of our commissioners are here, and a representative from Marcy Mostello's office is here. So we're very appreciative of that, and you guys as well making the time and really kind of showing the importance of these topics for the community. I also want to thank Butler County Drug and Alcohol Office that's in the room. I see Donna in the back as well, and we have Lisa, our prevention specialist, that's going to be running a breakout from the county as well for us to share some really important and worthwhile resources. All of our sponsors and donors today, the breakfast that's provided was all donated, and we're very, very appreciative of that, of Donut Connection and Chris Lund and his team for donating that as well. When people ask us why the symposium, why is this important, why does Geyser want to do this, get into this educational kind of space? We are the longest standing addiction treatment center in Butler County. We've been here 53 years. We've weathered a lot of ups and downs in the field, in the community, a lot of changes with addiction treatment. But we do feel like, as being the longest standing addiction treatment provider, that we have an obligation to sort of share education, share prevention, and give everybody an opportunity to talk about addiction in a safe space, to break down the stigma. And ultimately, that's what these events are about, is to really break down the stigma, if nothing else. So we can talk about addiction, talk about these issues, and provide support for families or those struggling with addiction in a safe space, in a safe way, and in a non-judgmental way. And the more we can do these events, and with the partnerships of the community, the more we're going to go into breaking down that stigma. So I thank each and every one of you today for clearing your schedules to attend this event, to participate in this event, ask some good questions, take some good information back, and if nothing else, hopefully we can save at least one life out of these events. Thank you all very much, and I'll turn it over to our medical director, Dr. Brophy, to kick off our keynote.
Good morning, everybody. Give me 1 second here Okay, I like to walk around a little bit, as most of you who have heard me speak before already know. And I appreciate you guys coming. When I'm putting this lecture together, I know a lot of you have heard me speak before, and you're going to see some familiar slides. But as a keynote speaker, and this being the second year in a row that we're doing this, you have to kind of think, do I really want to give much of the same talk as last year? Some people want that. Some people think like, oh, I want to hear that again, because the more we hear it, the more it kind of solidifies in our brain. And other people, of course, want to continue that conversation from where we left off last time. But we're going to do a little bit of both. We're going to cover some of the important neurophysiology that we talked about last year, especially for some of the new faces in the room. And then we're going to really focus on family, right? And how family is involved in all of those steps. And that's sort of our focus of this entire day today, is the family matters angle. And we are hoping to make this a yearly annual symposium. So please provide feedback, provide, topics that you want to hear about in the future. This is something that matters to everybody in this room. I talk about that often a lot, like addiction is impacting every single person in this room, whether you think it is or not. And we can circle back around to that later. But so today we're gonna start off by talking a little bit about some of the trends that families are dealing with at home related to substance abuse, related to our understanding of substance abuse. Then we're gonna review some of the neurophysiology, some of those slides that you guys saw last year about, the hangry guy who, isn't thinking normally because he's hungry, thirsty, that kind of stuff. Then we're gonna go into how all of that applies to addiction and treatment. And then lastly, the family role in all of that. So, you guys remember some of these pictures? Some of them you've seen before. This, of course, our understanding of addiction has evolved tremendously. It used to be very much like, this is your brain on drugs, make better choices, do better. Okay, and that actually started from an early functional MRI image where they would look at people that were struggling with addiction and they would say like, oh, that person's brain is abnormal. That's why they're a drug addict. That's why they're struggling. When the truth is that everybody starts off with this normal brain here on the left, and over time it becomes that brain on the right. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. In the past, it was implied as a moral and ethical failing. We also looked at MAT as trading one addiction for another. And we also thought that we could punish our way out of these behaviors, which if we could punish our way out of them, we wouldn't have the epidemic of addiction that we have today. Now we understand that choices do play a role early on, less so as those brain changes continue to evolve. The moral and ethics of the individual are irrelevant. It happens across all boundaries and all borders. And MAT is more of trading addiction for a stable chemical dependence. Punishment models don't work, and genetics are responsible for about 50% of a person's risk for addiction. We're gonna cover that a little bit in the breakout session as well, going down that genetics talk a little bit further. Getting into some of the trends, so this is the poppy plant. This is the Papaver somniferum plant. This is where most opioids traditionally came from. And the reason why I put it up there is because fentanyl. Fentanyl is the big trend. Fentanyl is all we hear about. In fact, it's been about 2 years since I've actually seen heroin. We don't see heroin anymore. It's all fentanyl. And that is because fentanyl, as many of you may know, it's a synthetic. You don't need the plant. So you don't need a warm tropical location. You don't need to harvest, manufacture, ship, smuggle it under borders, all that kind of stuff. All you need is a good chemist. And the fentanyl that's coming out continues to get stronger and stronger. There's acrofentanyl, acetylfentanyl, carfentanyl. And these are things that, carfentanyl is meant as an elephant tranquilizer. It has no use in humans. But these are the things that make their way into the illicit drug market and can be incredibly dangerous. And it's what makes experimentation a whole new ballgame. Experimentation has always been a part of the human experience. We experiment to see how comfortable we are with different boundaries, and we adjust our boundaries as we're growing and developing based on how we feel whenever we engage in those activities. We're seeing it in our pressed pills. We're seeing it in the bags of cocaine. We're even seeing it in like the marijuana vapes. So, fentanyl, that has become very important even as families search their child's bedroom, right? There was a school resource officer just a couple years ago that just brushing off the Kevlar of his vest aerosolized some fentanyl. That fentanyl landed in his nares and he immediately overdosed on opioids. And thankfully they had Narcan around, to save this guy. But that's not even an uncommon story anymore. I mean, a lot of times whenever they're doing these drug raids now, instead of, kicking in the door and rushing in like a SWAT team, they're going in hazmat suits. And it's because these chemicals are so incredibly dangerous and very, very small amounts can be fatal. So the evolution of marijuana is something else that is strongly impacting families at home. And I get a ton of questions about this kind of stuff, because mom or dad or aunt, uncle, grandparent, even sibling may be using medical marijuana to control some of their mental health symptoms. Kids, they see that hypocrisy. They see that difference between, well, you don't do it, but it's okay for me to do it. And it's bad for you and it's a gateway drug, but Uncle Susie, she takes it and yeah, just don't worry about that. And that's never a way to help kids. The right way is to educate them honestly and to have those discussions about introducing this stuff into a developing brain versus a brain that has already reached its mature level of development. But also to explain to them, some of the different consequences, and also explain to them like how marijuana ended up in the situation that it's in, where it's a Schedule I drug. So not a lot of studies have been done on it, but we do know that it's significantly less dangerous than some of the medications that we do prescribe to control things like anxiety, depression, bipolar, all that sort of stuff. But this is a conversation that's happening in families, and these are actually bootleg marijuana vapes. So they look very much like what you get from the pharmaceutical dispensary. However, a lot of those are just people making it in their basement. And so, of course, that poses a whole new level of danger. And it wasn't that long ago that bootleg marijuana vapes were found in Butler that actually tested positive for fentanyl. So the fentanyl is making its way into that illicit drug market as well. And then, of course, vaping. Vaping, whether you're talking about vaping nicotine or vaping marijuana, vaping has really kind of changed the landscape, particularly when we're talking about high school students. Whenever we go to the schools, that's all we hear about. They'll bring out a case of 200 vapes, that they've confiscated over the past year. And they're just in panic mode. They don't know what to do. And there has always been, the experimentation at the high school level. Vaping allows it to be a little bit more conspicuous. It's a little easier to hide. It's a little bit easier to, go into a bathroom, hit your vape a few times, and then come out and not smell like smoke and not sort of, have that giveaway. And so it's the portability of it, the accessibility of it, the socially acceptable nature of it. These are things that all families are having a difficult time with their teenagers, particularly when these substances are involved. And these are some of the advertisements that the kids are seeing in relation to vapes, and they're very concerning. I mean, this was just from 2016, and 66% of teenagers thought that vapes were just flavoring, not realizing that they had addictive substances like nicotine, certainly not realizing that some of them had things like marijuana. And even today, these are more recent advertisements that you see online where the companies that sell these vape products are trying to convince kids that, it's safer, it's cheaper, it's all these kinds of things. So this is what we're up against. Like when we're talking to these kids, they're online constantly. They're getting bombarded with this stuff. And a lot of it is actually like targeting and advertising to get them hooked on these products. This company, Juul, just settled a class action lawsuit for specifically targeting our children. So these are things that we should all be paying attention to. Carcinogens are just one of the many problematic things with vapes, and vapes are not FDA approved. We do know that they contain carcinogens in them, and so, with the reduction of cigarette smoking, we are seeing less lung cancer, but we're seeing more lip and esophageal cancers as a result of the increased vaping. Okay, so some vaping effects. This is some of the stuff that I go over whenever I meet with kids and I educate like local high school students. A lot of them don't realize that this is actually having an effect on your brain, and we don't really have a full understanding of it because it's not FDA approved and because there are no long-term studies. But whenever they do autopsies on a teenager who vapes versus a teenager who doesn't, they are finding significant brain changes, including less neurons in the prefrontal cortex. We're going to talk in a minute about that prefrontal cortex and why it's so important. But it's when I talk to the kids, I always say, does anybody want to sign up for less brain cells? Nobody does, right? Nobody wants to get less intelligent over time. Okay, so just to kind of circle back, so some of the trends that we're seeing in the family household that people are dealing with, fentanyl is of course a very big one, so are the medical marijuana products and vaping as far as both nicotine and cannabis. These are some other ones, and we're not going to go too far into this today, but these are the things that you're going to continue to see in the news cycles. These are the things that are going to continue and emerge as a problem. One of them is xylazine. So a lot of you have probably heard about xylazine by now. It's a sedative that's actually added to the dope, and it, quote unquote, gives the dope legs. So it's not an opiate. It's actually an alpha adrenergic agonist, but it works on a part of the brain that also suppresses respirations. Okay, so like as a sedative. The reason why it's so dangerous is because our first responders are all trained to give Narcan, right? Well, Narcan doesn't work on xylazine. If somebody does a mixture of fentanyl and xylazine and you give them Narcan, the Narcan will reverse the fentanyl, but it won't reverse the xylazine. So depending on how much xylazine a person is exposed to, that's the big concern. The other thing with Tranq is it has a vasoconstrictive effect at the site of the injection. So what that means is they inject it, and right after they inject it into their vein, all those blood vessels in that area constrict. And that actually causes a little ischemic ulcer. So like the skin forms a little crater, and that will give the appearance of like this sort of flesh-eating, necrotizing type of appearance. And so it's often called the zombie drug because people are very sedated. They're often leaning all the way forward like this. And then you look at their arms and they're covered in these sores, these ischemic ulcers. And so anyway, the nickname for it is Tranq, or zombie drug. And that is something that has slowly worked its way from Puerto Rico to Philadelphia. Now it's heavily present in the Pittsburgh market. African Kush is another one. African Kush, like when I see that, it almost sounds just like some foreign type of marijuana plant or something along those lines, but it's not. African Kush is actually a combination of marijuana and opioids that is being smoked all through the country of Africa, and it's because fentanyl has become so prevalent. There's always been substance abuse in a lot of those, war-torn countries. And in fact, a lot of the soldiers, some of you may have know this from documentaries and things like that, but they chew a plant called khat. Has everybody heard of that? It's K-H-A-T. And it's like a stimulant type of a plant that they would chew on and almost get like a cocaine type of effect. Well, the reason that they were using that plant is because that's all that was readily available. Humans, especially when we are put under stress, strain, and hardship, we tend to self-medicate. They are self-medicating with that plant, but now that fentanyl has become so cheap and so widely available, it's now marijuana and fentanyl rolled into a cigarette and smoked. And this African Kush, I've seen investigative journalists going over and doing these stories, and you see entire rooms like this with construction workers, and they're all nodding off while on their break. They're abusing this African Kush compound. And then this one, it's called nitazene, is what everybody's calling it, like in the illicit drug market and on the streets. ISO is the other name for it. The full name for it is N-desethylisonitazene. Nitazene, of course, or ISO is a little bit easier to say, but what this is it's going to be the new fentanyl. It's actually more potent than fentanyl, as if we need anything more potent than fentanyl. It's easily made in a lab, like fentanyl, and it's coming across our southern border in large quantities. And so we are just starting to see, this has actually been known for about a year and a half now. And for the first time, last month, I actually saw an article on it where the DEA is warning Americans, this is the next opioid. Now, it does interact with the opioid receptors, so thankfully Narcan will work for that. But, with these trends, the trends are always evolving. The trends are always changing. It depends on, our technology, what we're able to produce. It depends on availability and that certain demographic and geographic area. But we have to understand the root causes of addiction, because if you squash fentanyl, well, then nitazene will take over. If you squash nitazene, some other opioid will fill the gap. If we're not addressing the mental health, if we're not addressing the baseline causes of substance use, then we're not going to make any progress. So let's talk a little bit about that. And this is where we're going to review a little bit from last year. So you guys know that I'm big on the neuroscience of addiction. That's my training and background from University of Pittsburgh. And I believe that until we understand the neuroscience of addiction, we really won't make any progress. The neuroscience of addiction, the main three things that I hope people take home from this are that dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's involved in all of our pleasure reward pathways. So whenever we talk about addiction, you hear about dopamine a lot. There's a lot of other neurotransmitters in the brain. There's serotonin, GABA, glutamate, epinephrine, norepinephrine, so on and so on. Dopamine is the one that's involved in all of the pleasure reward stuff, and it's what's involved in the limbic system. Neuronal hierarchy and neuroplasticity are the two things that we'll review next. And I often like to tell a story to kind of help explain that. In the past, I told a story that was about a baby whose mom gave that baby heroin. You guys have heard that story. You've heard me tell that story before. But if you haven't, here's another one, okay? About a year ago, a jail in Oklahoma had a couple of inmates that had done something that also sounds a little bit counterintuitive to survival and the way that we normally think. So a lot of times when people are on Suboxone, we convert them to an injection called Sublocade, okay? It's a little injection that goes in your belly, and it's in liquid form, but it reacts with your body fluids and it forms a little bead, like a little solid bead under the skin. And from that little bead, it slowly releases medications into that person's bloodstream. And that medication is buprenorphine. Okay, so the same thing that's in like Suboxone and a lot of those MAT buprenorphine products. What these two guys did is the one was given an injection of Sublocade and it formed a little solid bead, and the other one wanted that Sublocade. We normally don't see people manipulate things like injections, but what these guys did is they took a razor blade and 2 safety pins. Each one of them sliced their skin. The guy with the Sublocade milked that bead out. They put it into the other guy, and then they used safety pins to close the skin. Can I convince anybody in here to try that? Of course not, right? I mean, this is something like self-harm, things like picking up a needle that you know probably has hepatitis C on it, or putting yourself or your loved one in a situation that's counterintuitive to survival. These are the things that we look at and we judge, right? We say, like, how could they do that? How could they be so stupid? How could they be so selfish? How could they be so, pick your negative adjective. But truthfully, when you understand the neurophysiology of addiction, it makes a lot more sense. So that's what we'll go through next. And that behavior, understanding that behavior starts with this slide. So this is a slide of the central nervous system, and it's hard to see, but there's green clusters in the middle of the brain there. Can everybody see those green clusters? Okay. When we tag any addictive substance with a radioactive isotope, and we follow that molecule, so what you do is you attach a radioactive isotope to that molecule, then you inject it, and you watch on a functional MRI where the brain lights up, because that's where that substance is going. That's where that molecule is going. And when we do that, all addictive substances cluster in this part of the brain. And it's important to recognize that that is the middle part of the brain, or what we call the midbrain, okay, AKA the limbic system. But it's also important to note that you don't see clusters here. And this is called your prefrontal cortex, and that distinction is very important. Your limbic system, where all these drugs of addiction are concentrating, is also sort of referred to as like the caveman level of your brain. This is a very, very old part of your brain from an evolutionary standpoint. It's a part of your brain that kept us alive all the way through our evolution, through primates and beyond. So this part of your brain it actually keeps all mammals alive, and the other name for it is the paleomammalian system. You can find the limbic system in all mammals. Your limbic system drives you towards the key elements of survival: food, water, sex, shelter, safety. We all know from Darwinian evolution, it's survival of the fittest, right? There's constant competition in the natural world. Any organism that doesn't have food and water doesn't have nourishment, hydration, and can't meet basic needs. Essentially, on a cellular level, they cannot convert ATP to ADP. Therefore, they cannot create energy. Okay, so if you don't have food, water, and nourishment, you can't create energy. Your species will not survive very long. If you don't have sex or some other form of reproduction, right? You remember from biology, there's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. But if you don't have some form of passing on your genes to your progeny, your species will not be around for very long. And safety, shelter from weather, from the environment, from predators, from all of those sort of things. If you don't have safety, your species will not be along the planet for very long. And so these activities, that is the responsibility of the limbic system, okay? So we're going to circle back to that in a second. So what about the prefrontal cortex? Well, that prefrontal cortex, that's that front part of your brain. That's the really smart part of your brain. So the part of the brain that everybody in here listening to me, whether you're actually paying attention or you're thinking about, what you want to eat for lunch today or where you want to go next weekend, if you're using that smart part of your brain, you're using the part of the brain that makes us human, right? Like that's the one part of the brain that even non-human primates, they don't have that part of the brain. Chimpanzees, monkeys, they're all driven by these things: food, water, sex, shelter, safety. Humans, we are also driven by those things, but as those needs are met, we're now free to use our prefrontal cortex. We're free to use that smart part of our brain. However, that can change, okay? And that's based on if those limbic system needs are met. So one example that I like to give, because it just demonstrates this quite clearly, is often if I have a bottle of water or a Yeti, I'll keep it up at the front of the auditorium or wherever I'm speaking, and I'll often ask the high school kids, like, have any of you even paid attention to my bottle of water? Have you paid attention to this water full of Yeti? And naturally, nobody really has. But water is so important to our survival that we couldn't literally go 3 days without it. So how come you're not thinking about my water? How come you're not obsessing about how to get control of this water? Well, the answer is because you've all been hydrated, right? Everybody in here has had something to eat or drink in the last 24 hours. So that's freeing you up to use that smart part of your brain. Those resources have met that need, and now your brain is free to engage in whatever other exercise or activity. But how could we change that? Let's think if we chained up the doors, locked all the windows, and we were in here for 3 or 4 days. Do you think that you'd be thinking about my water then? Well, you certainly would be. In fact, the kids get a chuckle out of this one, but it's the truth. I tell them they would actually plot my murder for my water. And that's true. They would actually find their tribe. They would find people that they have the most in common with, whether that be just a friendship and a bond, or it be someone who kind of looks like them, walks like them, talks like them. They would find the other species that are most like them, and they would plot, how are we going to distract him and get his water? How are we going to survive? And we joke about that sometimes. We call it things like hangry. I tease my wife all the time. It's the only time she's ever in a bad mood, honestly. It's like when she's really hungry. But they've studied this across the spectrum, and they've even studied that judges will hand out different sentences based on their hunger and thirst level. So how scary is that? Like the sentence that you get, whether it's 8 years or 16 years, depends on the last time that guy had a Pepsi. I mean, it's terrifying, right? But think about this. You've all experienced this to some degree, maybe just not as extreme. And if you haven't, then try it. Go to the grocery store on an empty stomach, and a week later, go to the grocery store on a full stomach and see if you make different decisions. I promise you, you will. You will make very different decisions. But we always think, our ego always tells us that, no, we're in control. We're in control. Our brain, I can choose that or I cannot choose that to an extent until your brain chemistry changes. And then you are being driven by these older parts of the brain, okay? And that's what we see when addiction takes a foothold in the limbic system. The same thing happens. That smart part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex, that gets put to the side until those limbic system's needs are met. Okay, and that's the problem with addiction, right? Like we tell people everything they need to do, and in that moment they'll agree, like, yes, that's what I want to do. That's what I need to do. But we have to remember that then whenever they walk out there, as those needs are not met in that addiction center of their brain, their behavior will change in order to meet those needs, okay? And it doesn't stop at the limbic system. You can actually go a step further. And I always, ask the kids, like, well, okay, so now you're plotting my murder for my water. How could I get you to stop doing that? And the answer is if I would engage their brainstem, the oldest part of their brain, the part of the brain that's responsible for oxygen hunger and CO2 monitoring and literally your vital signs on a minute-to-minute basis. Well, if I engage that, then obviously this guy's not thinking about my water anymore because I have now engaged an older part of his brain. So that will bypass both the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex until its needs are met. Does that all make sense? Okay. The other thing is, so neuronal hierarchy, that's kind of what we talked about. These newer outer layers of the brain can always be overpowered and bypassed by the older parts of the brain. As we go back, neo-mammalian, new mammal, paleo-mammalian, because we can trace it back to that time period and through all mammal species. And then lastly, the oldest part of your brain is called the reptilian part of your brain because reptiles have brain stems as well. The other part that we really need to talk about, what leads to these major changes? What leads to somebody actually behaving and having not just like intermittent behavioral problems, but truly their personality almost changing over time. This is something that as I watched my brother go down that rabbit hole of addiction, I was absolutely fascinated by it. We see people that change on a fundamental level that we know has to be more than just dopamine and neuronal hierarchy, right? Because otherwise you could just meet the needs of that limbic system and that person can jump right back into a normal lifestyle. Well, what we understand now that we didn't really understand 30 years ago is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is kind of the hot new topic in neuroscience, and it talks about how your brain is constantly changing. And everybody in here in this room, your brain is changing right now just from listening to me. The old thought was your brain developed until you were 25 years old. Once you were around 25 years old, however you're wired at that point, that's how you're going to be wired. That's how you're going to be for the rest of your life. We would talk about nature versus nurture. You know, were they born an addict or did they become an addict because of their environment? Were they born a serial killer or did they become a serial killer over their environment? What we now understand with neuroplasticity is that your brain truly does continue to develop with laying down new neurons until you're around age 25. Okay, but that's not the end of the story. From that point forward, that network of neurons will continue to change and adapt and evolve based on your experience, based on whatever external stimuli that brain is being fed. Okay, so I like to use an example for this because it seems to work great at helping everybody understand it. So these are neurons, and this is how they look on a microcellular level with sort of that 3D web space. That's what you see also in movies like Spider-Man and X-Men, and you know, it's sort of navigating and flying through that 3D web. And I'm sure that's probably how it does look if we could shrink ourselves down to, you know, the nanometer level. But this is how they look in my textbook, okay? And neurons come in all different shapes and sizes, but they all have three basic components: a cell body, an axon, which delivers the electric signal, and then the branches are dendrites. And those branches are what reach out to the neighboring neurons, and that's where the chemical communication happens. So first there's an electrical signal called an action potential, and then when that action potential reaches the end of the dendrite, it dumps dopamine into that synapse. The neighboring neuron senses that dopamine, and the signal continues from there, okay? So let's do an example. It's cold, gray, and miserable. If you walked outside tomorrow morning and it was sunny and 70 degrees and you felt a warm breeze, that would feel really good, right? It feels good, so we know the dopamine is involved. But what neuroplasticity tells us is that in addition to that little squirt of dopamine, that there's actually a structural change in your brain. I'm going to say that again. There's actually a structural change in your brain. And that sounds dramatic, right? Like, oh, my brain's changing. Oh, my goodness. Well, how come I don't feel that? How come I don't feel like a different person from when I went outside and had that experience to when I came back inside? And the reason you don't feel it in that moment is because you have 200 billion neurons. And each one of those neurons has anywhere from dozens to hundreds of connections to its neighbors. So you go outside and that sun hits your face, and that change may be just maybe this neuron sending out a new connection to its neighbor, reaching that branch out a little bit further. Or maybe it pulls that branch back. But the point is there's some sort of structural change. And so the next question would be, why? Why is our brain changing in response to that? And the answer is because your brain has evolved has been trained over millions of years to chase dopamine. Okay? Initially, it was getting dopamine from food, water, sex, shelter, safety. But now we get dopamine from all sorts of things that give us pleasure, right? And your brain is changing because it wants you to repeat that behavior. It wants you to take more breaks and step out into the sunlight. It wants you to maybe make that a part of your daily habit and routine. Think about that with addiction. You put that drug in your body, it feels good. Even if the next day you're using that smart part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex, and you're saying like, oh, all right, felt good, had fun, but I'm smart. I'm not going to continue to make that mistake. I'm not going to continue to repeat that behavior because mom and dad told me this, Uncle Dr. Brophy told me this, whatever. But the dark part of it is that their brain is already changing, making them more likely to repeat that behavior. So times that by 10, times it by 100, by 1,000. Think about the person who uses drugs multiple times a day. In 1 year, they're using it more than 1,000 times. And each time the brain is changing, making it more likely for them to continue repeating that behavior. What do you think that brain's going to look like after a few years? How easy do you think that's going to be to reverse in 30 days? Not too easy, huh? That's why our treatment statistics are so poor. That's why somebody goes to a 30-day abstinence-based program and they only have a 5% success rate. And that's why we need to add in all these other tools and resources and continue to evolve that knowledge and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, continuing to pivot and tweak. Neuroplasticity is not something that I came up with. None of this stuff is. Neuronal hierarchy is not something that I came up with. This is all out there. It's just spread out. But if you look any of this stuff up, please do, because you'll learn more about it. You'll learn more about how your brain works. And by doing so, you can set yourself up for success in the future. And speaking of that, I often use this now when I talk to kids because, when I would go and I would give lectures about the neurophysiology of addiction, I would talk to high school kids. I would get about 80% of them. 80% of them would eye contact, coming up, asking questions afterwards, fully engaged. But there was always that 20% that thought, I don't care. I don't want to hear it. That won't ever be me. I'm captain of the wrestling team. I'm the head cheerleader. I'm whatever. That's not me. I'm ambitious. I'm driven. That's not going to be me. When I started to give this talk in the same manner, but use that neurophysiology as more of an empowerment tool, listen, your brain is changing based on the external stimuli it receives, right? This is powerful neuroscience. The neuroscience of addiction can get someone to abandon their child. It can get someone to walk away from a career path to which they gave decades of their life. That's incredibly powerful neuroscience. And if you understand that neuroscience, you can use it to your advantage. And I put these pictures up there because, I have about 30 different pictures, and depending on the group I'm talking to, I'll put it up there, but it's all self-help gurus, like Deepak or Tony Robbins or, anybody. But really what all these people are saying, and this one, it's not so much for Oprah, it's for that guy right there, and I'll explain in a minute. That's Malcolm Gladwell. I'll bet you some people in here know who Malcolm Gladwell is. The high school kids, of course, never know who it is. But what Malcolm Gladwell, he's a Harvard psychologist. He's incredibly brilliant. He's written, I've read 5 of his books. They're all amazing. He has a podcast, really, really bright guy. What he made popular with his book called Outliers is he was looking at people who are uncommon amongst uncommon people. So people that really are just on a different level. People like this guy, this David Goggins. Not only is he a Navy SEAL, like Special Forces, but he's the only guy in the history of the military that did all of the Special Forces. He was Green Beret, he was Delta, he was Navy SEAL. He the only person in the history of humankind that's been able to do all of those things. He also was in the Guinness Book of World Records for doing 2,500 pull-ups or something absolutely crazy to where his hands looked like raw meat and he was still doing pull-ups. He is well known to young kids because he's on social media all the time, and he's always trying to educate them, because what most people don't realize is despite all of those accomplishments, when he was 23 years old, he was 300 pounds. He could barely read. He couldn't pass the ASVAB test. He couldn't run a mile. And they told him he wasn't welcome in the military. He didn't have what it takes. He teaches people the process of how he, quote unquote, hardened his mind. Just like how Kobe teaches about the Black Mamba persona, Gary Vee teaches about entrepreneurship. What they're all teaching you is that you can actually drive the changes of your brain by carefully choosing those external stimuli. And that's really important for kids to understand, and that's really important for families to start talking about at home. You can't choose all of your external stimuli, right? Grandma's gonna get sick, dog's gonna get hit by a car, like, not to be doom and gloom, but these things happen, right? That's the hardship of life. But for the other 90% of those external stimuli, you can choose. So choose wisely. And I talk about how this neuroscience is behind a lot of the cliche statements that we say. Things like, show me your 5 best friends and I'll tell you your future. Why? Because our brains are changing based on those external stimuli. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Why? Because when you go through those hardships, your brain changes to make it more easy to navigate that same problem if you were to experience it again in the future. We talk about all these old cliche statements, and they're old cliches because for tens of thousands of years, they've held true. And so we need to pay attention to those kind of things. Treatment, like we talked about, terrible statistics rates. We continue to add tools like MAT and longer stays to improve those statistics. But what has a 100% success rate? Prevention. You can be genetically predisposed to be the biggest crackhead the county has ever seen. But if you never touch cocaine, you're never going to be that crackhead, right? We can talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but all of our treatment now is focused on the entirety of the individual, as it should be. It's what we call comprehensive. Not just their physical health and mental health, but their legal health, right? Their social health. Everything has to be looked at because it all impacts the day-to-day living of that individual. And we all follow the ASAM guidelines now, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine. So what about family? And how important is the family role? Is the family dynamic during all of this? Well, I can tell you that the family role impacts every single level, including before that child is even born. Before that addict is even born. The genetic makeup is important. From our understanding right now, we understand that your genes, your DNA, is responsible for about 50% of your risk. Environmental and other things, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that contributes the other 50%. But fetal brain development is impacted by everything that fetal brain is exposed to. And we're just beginning to understand that. I often tell people a very sad story, but it's true. My son came out of the womb anxious because when my wife was pregnant, that's when our oldest died of brain cancer. So he was exposed to those chemicals. He was exposed to those fluctuations in her mood. He didn't speak till he was 3.5 years old. He came out of the womb anxious, and we're just starting to scratch the surface on this kind of stuff. There's a new study that's coming out. They're kind of keeping it behind closed doors right now because they know it's going to make a ton of money. But what they're finding is that at birth, the day that baby is born, they can swab that baby's mouth and tell with 98% accuracy if that kid's going to be autistic. When that study gets unleashed, it's going to squash all the arguments about maybe it's vaccines, maybe it's this. But you know what that study suggests is that it's the external environment of the pregnant mom. And we've always known that you can have some slight impact on fetal brain development. You can play classical music for your baby, and things like that have been tried over time. We've never really scratched the surface on, and part of it is because we don't have the technology to actually see those changes taking place. We don't have the means to measure it. That's all changing moving forward. And what we're gonna find is that even the neuroplasticity of fetal brain development is going to have an impact in that kid's life down the road. That doesn't mean that any of those changes are permanent. Those changes are always reversible, and that's why there's always hope and recovery. But the family role, of course, before the baby's born. How about during childhood? The arguments that child may be hearing, the sibling substance use or abuse that may be occurring, education, communication, or lack thereof. A lot of trauma starts in childhood, and then that trauma leads to self-medication, which leads to substance abuse and addiction. What about during the substance use phases? Family is, of course, heavily involved and very important as far as support, enabling versus healthy support, and perception communication as well, and during recovery. I mean, we do all sorts of things to bring the families into that discussion and make sure that they understand the role that they have moving forward. And I think we need to do more of that. Just like it takes a community to raise a kid, well, the whole family should be involved in the health and well-being and recovery of those individuals. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This is something that we talk about all the time in the world of neuroplasticity, but you also have to remember that during all of these things, during fetal development, while the kid is observing and sponging and absorbing his environment, during the days of substance abuse, during the attempts at recovery, all of that neuroplasticity matters too. And so it does matter how we manage these things every step of the way. And one of the hardest things to get people to understand is no matter how much I love my brother, no matter how much you guys loved your daughter, no matter how much you guys loved your friend, that love will never get them better. It's never going to convince them to go to treatment. We know that what matters is the phases of change. In psychology, where is a person in their readiness, in their willingness, in their motivation? And unfortunately, when people are in that pre-contemplation phase, I just had a local superintendent, not a Butler, but down in Allegheny County, call me panicking. His friend has a child struggling with substance abuse, calling me thinking I would have like the magic bullet or the magic pill. Unfortunately, that child won't even have the discussion because they're not even willing to acknowledge that there's a problem. It's very difficult to make progress in situations like that because that motivation has to come from within. And even then, even when it does, they're going to cycle around on contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and they can come on and off that cycle at any point. But summarizing that family component, it's involved in all aspects of the addiction spectrum. And it's important to educate families so that they can be a positive aspect of that person's recovery. And treatment, in my belief, should always encompass the family and include those conversations. And our goal today is really, to focus on that family piece, that familial element, and how important it is. That's all I have for today. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you.
Armstrong has been a part of Butler County for over 60 years. We've run hundreds of miles of high-speed fiber, and we're not stopping. Your internet, television, and telephone connectivity is backed by a team of local technicians who are backed by their local office, who is backed by our 24/7 network operations team, as well as our 24/7 customer service center. Can the other guys say that? We didn't think so. Armstrong. Unmatched employees, unmatched technology, unmatched fiber network.